Well, welcome everyone to our virtual evening with Nancy Pearl. I'll start with a brief introduction. Nancy Pearl, librarian and advocate for readers around the world, is the 2021 recipient of the Librarian Award for Outstanding Service to the American literary community. Presented by the National Book Foundation, the award honors an individual for a lifetime of achievement in expanding the audience for books and reading. National Book Foundation Executive Director Ruth Dickey commented, quote, Nancy Pearl's energetic commitment to spreading the joy of books has truly helped build our national culture of reading. For decades, Nancy has worked closely with libraries, literary organizations, and community groups in the US and abroad to share her infectious love of books with individual readers, and entire communities. We are delighted to celebrate her long career of important work, keeping literature at the center of conversations, unquote. On November 17th, Nancy received the award from Ron Charles, literary critic of the Washington Post, at the 72nd National Book Awards ceremony. I cannot imagine this award going to a more deserving person. Nancy Pearl has tirelessly fueled readers everywhere by promoting the love of books and the love of reading. Tonight, Folio would like to honor Nancy as well by celebrating her illustrious career and life. So, Nancy, how does receiving this award make you feel?
Well, it's a little daunting to realize that you're old enough to have a lifetime award mean something. And, you know, Lillian, Ruth's talking about decades, and I believe there was the word long in that description. No, it feels like it validates my whole life. And it makes me think that wouldn't it be great if there was like a reading pandemic, you know, to be infectious, and I think it's probably, you know, I never knew how to describe myself, but librarian, I think, is just a great one-word description. So I was just absolutely thrilled, and it was just great.
Yeah.
And it was wonderful to have Ron Charles introduce me. You know, they asked who I would like to have introduce me, and Ron was high on my list because, you know, he's the one book reviewer, or certainly a book reviewer, that I have such respect for and such admiration. And, you know, even when I don't agree with him about a book, and it's usually that he likes a book better than I do. You know, we both tend to dislike the same books. You know, it's not, he talks about what it is about the book that he, you know, why he feels the way he does. And I just think that's the best way of doing book reviewing. And, you know, he's just such a mensch.
Yeah. He's a true book critic, and very authentic in his own person and in his reviews.
Yes.
Yeah. So I think that was the perfect person. But the award is it's just so well deserved, and the world agrees. The world agrees. Oh, beautiful.
So there's the thing that I got, which is very heavy. And if I put it on, you know, I would have to be bowed over, which would be another thing about being old. But yes, it's just beautiful.
Yeah.
And it was really wonderful.
Yeah. It's a shame it couldn't have been an in-person event, an in-person ceremony, but it was still wonderful. And so what we do.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. And it was really good for me to sit down and think about what I wanted to say in my acceptance speech, and to keep it under 4 minutes and still get most of everything in that I wanted to get in. So that was really that was really also a good experience for me to do that.
Yeah. Yeah. And when I thought about this program, I thought, we really need a whole week to talk about all your accomplishments. And for you to distill it down into 4 minutes is like impossible. But tonight we're going to try and talk about some of the most impactful accomplishments, but we really do need a week. So tell us how it started. What made you want to become a librarian?
Well, I write about this in the introduction to Book Lust, the book that Sasquatch published in 2003, which is that I grew up in a family that in Detroit, a lower middle class family that wasn't particularly a happy place to be. I would always rather be almost anywhere else than at home. And the place where I ended up living my childhood out was at my local public library in Detroit. And it was those two librarians, really one librarian, a woman named Frances Whitehead, who just opened up the world to me. I mean, she gave me the world in the books that she recommended. And, you know, when she met me, I was about nine or 10, and all I was reading was horse and dog books. And if we went to the Parkman Library today, Lillian, it's really just a shadow of its former self. But if we went today, I could take you and show you where in the children's section the horse and dog books were shelved, because they pulled them out from the regular kids fiction and had their own section. And that's all I would read. And one day Miss Whitehead came up to me and she said, "Nancy, we just got in a new book by Marguerite Henry." And of course, Marguerite Henry wrote Misty of Chincoteague and Sea Star. I mean, just a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful horse books. And she said, "Would you like to be the very first person in this library to read the book?" And I mean, who would not want to be the first person to read a library book, to get it before anyone else has had an opportunity to check it out? And of course I said, "Oh, yes." And, you know, I held out my hands. And in the first example of like bait and switch that I was ever, you know, that I ever encountered, Miss Whitehead said, "Oh, but before I give you that book, there's another book I really think that you'd enjoy reading." And she was Canadian, and she had grown up on a steady diet of British children's fiction. And she and I too, because of Miss Whitehead, grew up on a steady diet of British children's fiction, and that turned me into an Anglophile for sure. But she gave me The Wind in the Willows and Mary Poppins and The Hobbit and the Newbery Award winners, Johnny Tremaine, Strawberry Girl, all of those books. And little by little, she got me not totally away from that section, because I still loved my horse and dog books, but she really expanded my reading. And I knew that when I was 10 that I wanted to be a children's librarian, just like Miss Whitehead. You know, I wanted to do for other unhappy kids who hung out in the library all day and, you know, spent all day Saturdays there. I wanted to do for them what she did for me. So I really owe her so much.
As do we.
Yes, right.
We owe her as well. Yeah. Yeah. So your career as a librarian, you started out as a children's librarian, right?
I did. Yes. I started out as a children's librarian working in the Detroit Public Library system. Mm-hmm. And it would have just been so wonderful if they had assigned me to the Parkman Branch Library so I could have worked with Miss Whitehead. But that didn't. I was on the bookmobile and in other branches. But I was her colleague for a few years. And that was so, you know, extraordinary to have that happen. Yeah. So, yes, the Detroit Public Library, they deserve a lot. It was a wonderful library system, a fabulous library system. And actually the Detroit Public Library, this was back in the 50s, had an African-American woman as head librarian. Mm-hmm. And I think was probably the first library system in the country that had Clara Jones, her name was. And she's the person who hired me in the end, to do that.
She was smart.
Yeah, so I owe her too.
Yeah. And then from Detroit, you went to Tulsa and worked there for a while as a librarian?
Yes. So from Detroit, my husband got his PhD and got a job at Oklahoma State University, which is in Stillwater, Oklahoma. They play Notre Dame in the Fiesta Bowl, happy to say. And when my children were little, I taught part-time at the university and didn't do anything. I wrote poetry and short stories, but didn't really do much of anything. And then we moved to Tulsa because we wanted a better education for the kids and maybe something more for me to do. And I started working at a wonderful, wonderful independent bookstore called Yorktown Alley Bookstore, and worked there for 9 years. And that was so had such an impact on my life. And I'm so grateful to the people who own, to Ken and Peggy Tracy, who had hired me to work there. And really that was where I started thinking about how do you, in the library world, we call it reader's advisory, but in the bookstore world, it's called hand selling. How do you understand when somebody says, can you recommend a book? How do you go about meeting that person's needs while keeping yourself out of the equation? And so it was at that bookstore that I really started thinking about that and sort of putting my feeling, my understanding or what I was doing into practice. And so those 8 or 9 years that I was at that bookstore were just were pretty magical. They were just great. And then I went to work at the Tulsa City County Public Library and was in charge of book buying for the library system for just a couple of years, and then was kind of winkled and wooed away to come to the Seattle Public Library in 1993.
Yeah. So that's how you came to work at Seattle Public. They wooed you. How did they woo you?
Well, the person who was the assistant director then, a man named Craig Buto, had worked in Tulsa, and he interviewed me when I was looking for a job at the Tulsa Library. And I remember after talking to him, it was maybe a half an hour interview, I went home and said to my husband, I have met somebody who thinks about libraries the same way I do. And so he and I really sort of bonded over our belief in the role of libraries in a community. And then he left and went to be the assistant director here in Seattle. And and meanwhile, my younger daughter had dropped out of college and moved to Seattle. And so I had come to visit her. And of course, I saw Craig, and Craig and I had lunch together at the Red Robin on what used to be the Red Robin on 4th and on 4th Street near the library. And he said, well, what if we come up with a job for you at the library that really, lets you do everything that you do well, which is talking about books and recommending books, and not having to do anything that you don't do well, which is basically everything else. What if we came up with a job? What would you think? Do you think Joe would leave Tulsa and come with you? And I said, if you came up with a job, yes, Joe and I would make it work. And so Craig, found this job as head of the Washington Center for the Book. And I moved to Seattle all by myself, and Joe stayed in Tulsa for 4 more years until he could retire and then move out here with me. So we've been here since 1993, which is a pretty long time.
Yeah. Lucky for us. I remember hearing Craig speak about you. You weren't there, but it was at a library conference. And he said he asked you what you wanted to do, and you said, "I want to talk about books." And he said, "Well, what else do you want to do?" And you said, "I want to talk about books." And it went on and on like that. So, I mean, and he understood that. He understood that,
Yeah.
and created this job for you, the executive director of the Washington Center for the Book.
Right. I mean, I think what was so spectacular or was so important is that Craig recognized the role that the public library has in a conversation about books and reading. You know, that expanding the traditional role of the library out into the public. So when I first came, and was kind of, finding my way and introducing myself to, different groups, I would go out and talk to book groups in their homes, and or the library. Lillian, you invited me to the West Seattle Library, and talk about ways of keeping a book group healthy and happy.
Yeah.
Which also, I mean, it was all this stuff that I had just been thinking about for a really long time. And that gave me a chance to go out and put it in practice.
Right. What a wonderful opportunity.
Yeah.
I was going to mention that you went around to libraries and neighborhood book groups,
Yes.
with your bag of books, talking
Yes.
about
Right.
the new and exciting titles that are coming out.
Yes,
And
I used to carry these just huge bags of books in those cloth bags, and I finally gave it up when I was speaking on Orcus, and I had to walk from the ferry to get to the library or downtown or wherever. And then I thought, I'm not carrying these books anymore. I'll do either book covers or nothing.
yeah. That was a lot, lugging those books around.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
But you also, when you came here, you got a job as an adjunct professor at the University of Washington.
I did.
High school. Yeah.
Yes, the library school before it was the I school.
Right. Okay.
Yes, and that was due to a man named Peter Hyatt, who at one time was the head of the library school, but when I met him was teaching, and he was really interested in readers and readers advisory, and so he invited me to come speak to his classes, and that gradually expanded to doing for many years, teaching 2 classes every year, which was really just a wonderful experience, and thought that so many of my students, and Lillian, you finally were one of my students, that my students are sort of out in the world, and that I can, I doing such wonderful things and kind of taking what we had discussed and gone over in class and applying it in their own lives. And one summer, I taught at the Syracuse University's library iSchool. It's definitely an iSchool, an information school, an iSchool, and it was a very small class, and there were maybe eight people, and we all just became, it was like for a week solid of meeting from 9 to 5, and we all became very close. And I still hear from some of those students in that class, especially because it was such a good opportunity for us to, when you're talking about books that you love, you're talking about your life.
Yes.
And even if you're talking about books that you didn't like, and you think about the reason why you didn't like them, oftentimes it illuminates something that you weren't aware of, or you hadn't thought about until you think about it and articulate that.
Yeah. I have to say that I am convinced that many of us who went to University of Washington did so just so we could take your reader's advisory. I'm really serious about that. And you Readers Advisory is very, I mean, it's something you specialize in. What, and some of it came from your work in the bookstore, but it's a lot grander than that. Tell me what makes it so important to the library profession, this idea of Readers Advisory.
Well, I think that it's important because, to me, it's important that a library not lose the traditional role of books and reading as being literacy, as being the main benefit that we give the community, not the only benefit, but the main benefit. And I like to think that library service is like a three-legged stool, so that there's, and if you don't have all those legs equal, that's going to be a very tippy stool. So, the reading and Readers Advisory, the traditional role is one leg of that. The programming is another leg of that, and then the whole information access is another leg, and that third leg. And too often, I think, in the present day, so many libraries have not so much abandoned, perhaps, but have really taken that reading role, supporting the pleasures of reading, and really put it to one side, because there are things that either that they've been forced to take on because nobody else has taken them on, or that when you say, I mean, I know when I get asked to speak somewhere and they're advertising it as, librarian Nancy Pearl, like, oh God, why would you invite a librarian? It's not very sexy. It's not very forward thinking, to relegate, I think too many library directors, too many library boards, just think that reading isn't sexy enough to bring people to the library. But that's so wrong. So wrong. And reading and sharing that reading is what does bring people to the library, and how we can help those people find the books that they will enjoy is a major is something that's important to teach our librarians to be. And that's what Readers Advisory is. Okay. And the big thing about Readers Advisory is if somebody says to you, oh, can you recommend a good book? Well, the first book that comes to your mind is always going to be the book. If any book comes to your mind, first of all, it's the hardest question in the world. Yes. If that, and what are you reading? When people say, what are you reading, Nancy? I mean, usually if I'm going out, to give a talk or going out in public, and I think somebody's going to ask that, I write the names of 3 books on my hand, so I can sort of casually look down and, but the older I get, this goes back to age, the more your skin is not easy to write on the way it is when you're like, 25. Anyway, but a book that you like is not necessarily a book that person standing in front of you will also like. So really our job as a Readers Advisory librarian is to figure out what kind of book that person likes. And that's part magic, and it's part science, or a kind of science, I guess. It's part being intuitive, understanding, and mostly, I think, honestly, it's listening to what the person said. And what I tried to teach my students was that if somebody says, can you recommend a good book for me to read, to say, tell me about a book you enjoyed, and then listen to that statement and then go from there. But not but to understand that no two people ever read the same book, that we all read very different versions of a book. And that's because we bring to the reading of the book who we are, our whole lives up to that point. And something in a book that that you might think is important, somebody else is not going to find it important. I remember recommending a series of mysteries that I really enjoyed. The main character is a woman named Ruth Galloway, who's a professor of archaeology in the north of England, and part of the book, I mean, sort of not part of the mystery, but part of the setup of the book is that she ends up having an affair with the police chief, the head of the police force in that small town. And I was telling a friend, and this was a good friend that I knew, a lot about, and we shared many types of books that we both enjoyed. And I told her, I said, oh, I think you'd really like this book, and Ruth Galloway, and she's having an affair with the policeman. And my friend got this just look on her face. And she said, I don't read books about people who have affairs with other people who are married. To me, it was just a minor part of the book, but to her, that would have been a major part of the book and a major stumbling block. Well, you wouldn't know that unless, that jumped out at you for various reasons, I assume, that happened in the past. So.
Yeah. It's definitely a skill, and it's a skill that really librarians hone, and thanks to you, I feel like you have mentored an entire army of librarians who are proficient in this skill of readers advisory, both in this country and internationally. And it's a little bit different from booksellers, because my experience, booksellers don't have that skill. They haven't had that kind of instruction on what how you go about. I remember going to a bookstore, and I don't even know what I had told them a book, but then every book they showed me was an African-American book,
right,
or an African-American author. And I was like, this is all you see.
Right. Yes. Exactly. Yeah. And I mean, that story, Lillian, which you shared with me before, is a cautionary tale that you can't judge what people like by looking at them.
Yeah.
And you can't make and we make these assumptions all the time about people. And it just makes I find it a little bit infuriating that some of the major review journals will assume that only a Jewish writer can review only a Jewish reviewer can review a book that deals with Judaism, or the main characters are Jewish, or the author of the book is Jewish. I find that just so, or that an Asian reviewer is the only person who can review a book by an Asian writer. We could go on forever and talk about.
Yeah, but that's what books do. They connect us across cultures, right, across time, across place. They're very diverse. So so you mentioned some of the programs, your bag of books, you're going around talking about book groups. And there's one other little known program you started. You started a poetry discussion group at Seattle Public Library. I think it was around 1999 or 2000. And it was a brown bag group. People met at lunch. They talk about a poem. They do it every week. That group has been meeting up until the pandemic weekly, discussing a poem without you. They just kept meeting. And that is an amazing legacy. I have turned people onto that poetry discussion, and they've fallen in love with it up until the pandemic.
Right. And that's such an easy program to do. I mean, but there are library directors who don't believe that, public library directors who don't believe that librarians leading book groups in the library is what they should be doing. It should not be part of their schedule. And I just find that kind of thing very depressing, of course, but also very short-sighted.
Yeah. I agree as a librarian.
Right.
And now we can't not talk about one of your most amazing programs, which is the Common Read. If all of Seattle read the same book, now called Seattle Reads.
Right.
Where did that inspiration come from?
Well, I've always believed, one of the beliefs I brought to Seattle with me was the importance of not so much importance, but the way that being in a book group helps you develop a common language. Even if it's a kind of book group that you and I both take part in, different ones where we're meeting weekly, but we just go around and talk about what we've been reading. Even that, because people will hear you talk about a book and then they'll read the book, and then you have that connection with them. That book groups can connect people. And, I loved the idea of neighborhood book groups, or, book groups that meet because their kids are all on the same t-ball team or whatever. But even more than that, I love the idea of people coming together in a public space like a library and reading a book and talking about a book. And the library, the Center for the Book, the Washington Center for the Book at the library, which I was then the executive director of, got a grant from the Lila Wallace Reader's Digest Foundation. We were one of 8 literary organizations around the country, and one other library besides us got this grant to develop programs to expand the reach of literature, to bring in new audiences for literature. And the Lila Wallace people were very smart of methods, because one of the things that they did was give you money for a year's planning, in which you could hire someone to come in and help work through any of the issues. And we had a wonderful woman who helped us work through this. And I knew that I wanted to have it to do with book groups. And we, maybe that everyone could read the same book. I mean, we were just tossing around ideas, and then Nancy Stilger, who was the advisor that we brought in, or the consultant, I guess is what she was, said, well, what if we called it If All Seattle Read the Same Book? And, that was so wonderful, kind of encapsulated everything that I believed in. But of course, Seattle Reads is a much better title for it, because If All Seattle Read the Same Book is the clunkiest name ever. But the first one was in 1998, and the first book was a book that I knew right from the start that we had to do, because I wanted a book that demanded, when you finished it, that you talk about it, that was so that you turned over the last page and you thought, gosh, I wonder. And what you wondered would depend on your reading. And the book was Russell Banks' The Sweet Hereafter. Yeah. Which I still think, I still get emails from people asking, what are some good books for book groups? And that's always on the list. And even in 1998, that was not a new book. There was the film was coming out of that book, or very shortly. Maybe it was already out, but it was not a new book. But it was a book that, and if you haven't read it, you have to read it because it's just fabulous. And it's about set in a small town in upstate New York. And it's about a school bus accident. And one of the many interesting things about the book is that Russell Banks tells the story from 4 different points of view: from the point of view of the bus driver, Dolores, from the point of view of the father of 2 of the students on the bus, and from the point of view 2 of the students on the bus who were killed, and from the point of view of a teenage girl who was on the bus and is going to be paralyzed for the rest of her life, and from the point of view of the lawyer who comes to town to try to get everybody to sue everybody else, basically. So there's a discussion question for you. Why did Russell Banks choose to tell the story that way? It's really always interesting to me when I'm reading a book to ask myself why the author chose to tell it the way that he or she did. And that's one of those. Russell Banks' book is perfect for that. And the other thing about the book, for me, the best books for book groups are books that are character driven. So when you finish the book, and we brought Russell Banks to Seattle, and we said, we don't want you to write a speech. We just want you to stand up there and answer questions from the audience as though it were a kind of a book group. And we took them all around the city. And the first question that everybody asked was, what happened after the book is over to that father whose twins children were both killed, to Jack and Sel? And I remember Russell would say, I don't know what happened to him. And my co-writer, Jeff Schwager, and I interviewed Russell for the book, The Writer's Library. So we saw him about 2 years ago, just before the pandemic. And I said, I've always wished that you would write a book about him, about that man, because I really want to know what happens to him. So that was the first book. The second book that we did was just another fabulous book club book. This one by Ernest Gaines, called A Lesson Before Dying. And which I can't imagine 2 better books for book groups than those 2 books.
They were both powerful.
Right. Very powerful, and much, much, much to talk about in both. And then the third book was a book by Bill Moyers, a collection of poetry that Bill Moyers had put together. And, I wanted to do poetry. I wrote poetry for many, many years until the lines stopped coming as poems and started coming as prose. And then I stopped. But I knew it would be hard to get an audience if we did poetry.
Yeah.
But I knew we would get an audience if we had Bill Moyers. And we had a huge audience that
was huge.
Then. Right. And then, and then one of the other things we did about that same time, the Center for the Book and a group of other organizations did a series called The Poets Among Us, in which I interviewed 5 poets. And this was at the Asian Art Museum at the auditorium. So interviewed David Wagner, interviewed
Colleen McCullough.
Yes, Colleen McCullough, right. And Heather McHugh.
Yeah.
And oh my gosh, I know his name as well as I know my own name, who wrote the Part-Time Indian, the Part-Time Diary.
Sherman Alexie,
right. And Sherman Alexie, they were all just fabulous, such wonderful audios. It was so interesting talking to them.
Yeah, that was an amazing program.
Yeah.
I went to every one.
I know, Lillian, you're so good. I hate to leave the house.
Well, that common read was adopted just all over the world.
It was.
And you were the inspiration for it. That must make you, how does that make you feel to be an inspiration? for this amazing program?
Well, it just, everything is, first of all, of course, there were other people. It wasn't just me. I mean, I have lots of ideas, but I am not somebody who is a, item one, cross it off, item two, cross it off. I do not have that kind of mind at all. So none of this would have happened if it weren't for people who did have that kind of mind. But yeah, it really is, it's, in a way, it's the perfect library program because you can make it as grand or as small as you want.
Yeah.
And, I had strong feelings about the kind of books that I wanted to do here. I wanted books that talked about important issues, that talked about life and death, that talked about race, that talked about poetry, for goodness sake. But other people and wanted to do bestsellers, that they wanted to have everybody read a particular book, or there was a particular book that fit their community. And I mean, it's amazing. It's fabulous that it's still going on in Seattle and other places. People, I still occasionally get an email from somebody saying, oh, this is what we did this year. And I love it. I love people are so inventive and they do such interesting things.
Yeah. And it's also a way to honor our storytellers, the authors who create these fabulous books. Right. I remember Russell Banks was like, everybody's reading my book. This is so exciting.
Yes.
So I think it's a wonderful way to honor authors who give us these amazing stories. Wanted to go to your collaboration with Sasquatch and how that came about with your Book Lust series, which is another amazing legacy that you have.
So back in like 2002, I got a call from Gary Luke, who was then an editor at Sasquatch Books. And Sasquatch was best known for the Best of the Northwest, Best of Seattle. They had a wonderful tagline, which I can't remember now. But anyway, Gary called and, I had met, one of the things that we did at the library too, was once a month, we had a literary salon on Friday afternoons where anybody could come. We had tea and cookies and sometimes we had a speaker. But mostly it was just for book people to kind of get together, where better than at a library. And book people, booksellers, publishers, writers, readers who wanted to come. And I think Gary came to a few of those and, we talked and everything. And I was then doing KUOW, talking to Steve Scher every week. And Gary called and said, oh, Nancy, what would you think about doing a book for us about good books to read? And he and the Sasquatch people came up with the name Book Lust, which we both loved. And, Gary said, come down to the publishing, come down to our offices and we can talk about it. And so I went down there and I said, well, what kind of thing do you have in mind? And he said, well, I'm thinking of, like a book with, say, 300 categories, quirky categories, he said, quirky categories, maybe 300 words of book recommendations for each category. And, that's it. What do you think? He said. And I said, God, it sounds fabulous. I already had visions in my mind about what quirky categories I could come up with. And so I went home and I wrote the first section of that, which was very unquirky Civil War novels. And because the first grown-up book that I ever read was Gone with the Wind. at my library, at the Parkman Library, you couldn't check out an adult book till you were 13 or in the 9th grade. And when I turned 13, Miss Whitehead took me over to the adult section and introduced me to the librarians there, and then kind of let me go. And the first book that I checked out was Gone with the Wind. So of course I wanted to include Gone with the Wind. It's hard to have a Civil War section back in 2003 without having Gone with the Wind in it. But I wanted to include all of these other books, much lesser known books that I had loved about the Civil War. And I remember I sent it to Gary, I faxed it to Gary, and I said, what do you think? And he wrote back and he said, great, 299 more quirky categories to go. And so it begins with a section, My Name is Alice, which is novels by authors whose first name is Alice, and then ends with a section called, and this was really quirky, ends with a section called Zero, This Will Mean Nothing to You. Like, that's very clever, I thought. And then it's all books, which I had loved, about how the concept of the number zero came into Western mathematics.
Wow.
So so these are all, like, people always, I mean, my reading history is pretty much in book lust. And then a couple of years passed, or a year passed, and I kept getting all these emails from people saying, well, you left this book out. Have you never read, you idiot, have you never read this book? And I realized that I had forgotten so many authors, and it was so hard to realize that I had left out authors that I absolutely loved. And Gary said, well, why don't you do another book? And he and I really wanted to call it Book Lust 2, The Morning After. But in the end, they just flinched, and they called it More Book Lust, which is so boring. So in my mind, it's still Book Lust 2, The Morning After. And then I did a children's Book Lust, because after all, I was a child at one time, and I was a children's librarian. And then the fourth Book Lust book, which was really, really fun to do, because I did a lot of reading for it, was Book Lust to Go, books for armchair travelers and intrepid people, which I am not.
Yeah.
And that was really, really fun.
Yeah.
So those were the Book Lust books.
Yeah. It's an amazing series, and it's a series not only for readers, to discover books, but also it's a resource for librarians to and their readers advisory position or skills that they have. Right. There were quite a few titles in those books that were out of print. Right. So that led to another one of your grand ideas. Right. Tell us about that one.
So right from the beginning, I believe that any book that someone hasn't read is a new book. It's a new book to them. And that we do backlist, that is, older titles, a disservice in many ways, because we stop talking about them. And one of the things that I emphasized in these readers advisory classes was that go back into don't just stand by the new bookshelf, go back into the bowels of the library and find some of those older titles, because if someone hasn't read it, as I said, it's a new book to them. And there were some books that I included in Book Lust that were no longer in print, and that kind of broke my heart. And I really wanted Sasquatch to reprint them. I thought that would be just a great another collaboration, but they weren't in a position to do that then. But we started a Book Lust, but but there is a series. Amazon took it on because I wanted both print and ebooks. I didn't want just ebooks. I just wanted, forgive me, real books. I wanted print and paper books of those books. So we did a dozen adult books are back in print, and you could get them from the Folio organization, right? You can order them at bookshop.org.
Yeah, we put it in the chat.
Yep. Yeah. And they're these are probably 12 of my very, very favorite novels. I'll say they're all character driven. And the most popular one, the one that has sold the most copies, is a novel that I really have never met anybody who hasn't loved that book. It's called The Cowboy and the Cossack. And it's about a cattle drive in right after the Civil War. A group of Montana cowboys are taking a herd of cattle to Vladivostok for the Cossacks. And this is the meeting of East and West. And it was written during the Cold War, published during the Cold War. So you can really read it as a metaphor for what was going on. I love that book. There are a lot of people I know who love, as I do, character-driven fiction. And one very sort of quick and dirty, easy way to identify a character-driven novel is to look for books in which the title is the character's name, or the title is descriptive of a character. So About a Boy, Nick Hornby, or The Cowboy and the Cossack. But all of the books that I did in that series, the Booklist Rediscovery series, are all character-driven novels.
Yeah.
And I love them.
Yeah, I have read every one and have loved every one, all 12. Also, after the 12th title was published, a book discussion group was created at University Bookstore to discuss those 12 novels.
Right.
Many of the participants were students of yours from the iSchool.
Right.
So you had young people reading these older titles and they love them. And I was so impressed that
right.
It speaks to exactly what you're saying, that it's a new book.
Right.
It's not an old book.
And one of the funniest things that happened is that we were talking about a terrific novel called The Man in the Window by John Cohen, which is just one of those books you just want to hug. I mean, it's so wonderful. And we're talking along, and I'm looking at this young man who's sitting, a little bit away from me or at the table. And I look at him and I said, "Are you John Cohen's son?" Because I knew his son lived in Seattle, and it was John Cohen's son. So that was pretty special. Yeah. The Man in the Window. I mean, every time I say one of those books, I say, "Oh, that's my favorite book of those 12." But actually, every single one of them is my favorite book of those 12.
Plum and Jaggers.
Oh, Plum and Jaggers, such a good book. Yeah. Such a good book.
I encourage everybody to sort of poke around on those 12 titles. Everyone is great. You won't be disappointed if you choose any of them. So just have a look and see. So yeah, I think that was so much legacy, Nancy, so many wonderful things you've done. Now, when you retired from SPL shortly after the new building opened.
I did, yes, 2004, August.
2004. Mm-hmm. And I'm fairly certain I speak for everyone that we were happy for you, but sad for us, because we bemoaned the loss of our Nancy Pearl from Seattle Public Library.
Well,
but by this time, you had become a librarian of world renown. And your career only accelerated after retirement. I mean, it exploded. You started traveling. You went to Sydney, Australia for the Australian Writers Festival?
For the Sydney Writers Conference.
Okay.
Sydney Writers Festival, they call it. Yes.
Okay. Talk a little bit about that experience.
Well, that was just so much fun, because I got to meet just a bunch of librarians, a bunch of librarians in and around Sydney. And as a result of meeting those librarians, a couple years later, I went back to Australia. Well, let me put in a little parentheses. So one of the funniest, best gigs that I had was that I got asked by the Holland America line to be an entertainment on one of their ships, and I could I could choose any route that I wanted to take, and my husband could come with me. And so I know that they expected that I would just do an Alaska cruise, so it would be 3 or 4 days. But I saw that they had a cruise from Auckland to Sydney that was 2 weeks. And in 2 weeks, I would just have to do 4 45-minute or hour programs for whoever came to them. And so I thought, well, I want to go back to Australia, and I really wanted to see New Zealand. And so I did that. I said, that's the cruise. That's what I want to do. And they agreed. And so I wrote to this librarian in Sydney and said, look, I'm coming back. You wouldn't have to pay for me to fly, for any transportation. Would you like to set up, like me doing workshops in the various Australian states? And then I didn't hear back from her. And I thought, oh my gosh, I presumed too much. I shouldn't have, how you like start questioning yourself. I thought maybe my meeting her was more important to me than her meeting me or whatever. Anyway, and so I had just about given up when I got this email from her saying, okay, it's all arranged. You're gonna speak in Sydney on these dates, then you're gonna go to this town out in the country in Dubbo, Australia. You're going to speak there, then you're going to go to Brisbane, then you're going to go to Adelaide, then you're going to go to Melbourne, and do readers advisory day-long workshops for the librarians. And so that was really the festival itself was lovely, and I loved talking about the bookless books and all of that, and all that, but really doing those workshops and meeting those librarians and seeing that, the same questions come up, the same nervousness comes up when somebody asks you, can you recommend something? That was really a wonderful experience.
Wow. That sounds amazing. And for them to have you teaching readers advisory, the master, is really good for them as well. Yeah. Twice to Australia.
Right.
Whoa. You also went to Cambodia. What did you do there, and how was it?
So Cambodia, so I was very fortunate that cultural affairs officers at the U.S. From the State Department, the U.S. State Department in various countries have invited me to come and do book-related programs there. And the most recent was Peru for the Peruvian Book Fest. I guess it's called Book Fest. I mean, this huge event that they have every year in Lima, and I got to be there and and do various bookish things. But the first place that I did this was in Estonia, which was really I remember they sent me a description of what they wanted me to do. And, the first thing was a speech at the National Library, 5 hours. And I thought, 5 hours, I have nothing to say for 5 hours. I freaked out. And then, it was explained to me that not only would everything have to be translated from from English to Estonia? But there was also a break for tea and then lunch and then a break for tea again. So that was fine. The second place that I went was probably the most meaningful to me. I was in Sarajevo, in Bosnia-Herzegovina. And this was in 2013. And the cultural affairs officer there wanted to do a program called, that would have all Bosnian kids reading the same book. And the book that she had chosen before I was involved with the program was Sherman Alexie's The Absolutely True Diary of a Part-Time Indian. And when she told me that, I thought, that is a weird choice. Why would I mean, how is that going to go across the Atlantic Ocean into Bosnia, Herzegovina? What are teens going to get out of that from that? Well, I was totally wrong. It was the absolutely perfect book. So, like we could do a whole other session on Bosnia. So Bosnia-Herzegovina is really a state that is not a state. It's divided among the Muslims and the Serbs and the Croats, each with their own religion. The Serbs have a section of the country called Srpska, and they don't recognize Sarajevo as the capital. There are two library associations in Bosnia, the Serbian Library Association and the Bosnian Herzegovinian Library Association. But this cultural affairs officer, Sunshine Eisen, is just fearless, and she persuaded that the necessary people in all different parts of Bosnia to let their teens take part in this. And one of the wonderful things that our government does is sponsor libraries that are in which the books and the computers and stuff are bought by our government, but they're staffed by citizens of those countries. And so I got to work with those librarians from around Bosnia, and also with teachers. These are people who were going to lead the discussions. And these discussions would bring together teenagers who otherwise have nothing to do with one another, because the Serbian students do not go to school with the Croatian students, the Croat students. The Muslim students are educated in their own schools. There is nothing. It's like apartheid in three separate silos, if you will. And as a result of this, we were going to bring these teens together to talk about this book. And one of the things that the book is about, and again, if you haven't read the book, The Absolutely True Diary of a Part-Time Indian, it's just a fabulous book. But one of the things that the book does, at the end of the book, there's a list of the different tribes that the main character, this young teenage Native American, he makes a list of all the tribes that he belongs to. So he's in the tribe of cartoonists. He's in the tribe of 15-year-old masturbators. He's in the tribe of, the Spokane Indian tribe. He's in, and goes on like that. So when I was going around the country teaching, doing workshops for these librarians and teachers about how to lead a book group, I would start and they had all read the book before they came together. I would start every discussion by saying, let's go around the room and each one of us say a tribe that we belong to. And in the first one, and this always makes me cry, in the very first meeting that we had, the first woman to speak said, I belong to the tribe of people with Muslim mothers and Serbian fathers. Mm. And if you know anything about the war in Bosnia and the ethnic cleansing that went on the part of the Serbs against the Muslims, you know how what a different world that was for this woman who was an adult, for this woman's parents to have married. So she said that. And from the back of the room came this voice, another woman who said, I'm in that tribe too. And there's a connection, a powerful, powerful connection. So being in Bosnia, kind of seeing how everything that I had always believed about the power of reading to bring people together was kind of made, it really solidified my thinking about that. And, I sort of say if I had done that when I was, if I had experienced that being in Bosnia, where there's the best hot chocolate ever, and there's a fabulous vegan restaurant in Sarajevo, probably the best vegan restaurant I've ever eaten at. If I had done that, say in my 40s, I think my life would have taken a somewhat different direction. Actually, not that the direction it's taken has been bad at all.
Yeah. What kind of different direction, though?
I think I would have done. Not trying to be a foreign service officer at all, but I think I would have. I think I would have. There was something so powerful to see in a country that is as wrecked as Bosnia is, that maybe there's a way to bring people together, that maybe this is what we should be doing, those of us who believe in the power of books to change the world, in Israel and Palestine and the other troubled spots where it's what we should be doing in the United States, continue to be doing in the United States.
It's interesting how books divide us here, because the absolutely true diary of a part-time Indian is always on the challenged list, on the banned books list, where, here in the US, but in another country, it's being promoted and bringing people together. So it's very, very curious.
Yeah.
Well, that's another amazing part of your life, all the global travel and all the global good you've done. So wonderful. You are a published author of many nonfiction books related to Reader's Advisory, many. But during retirement, you also took this time to write your very first novel, George and Lizzie. What was the inspiration behind George and Lizzie? Have you always wanted to write a novel?
I hadn't. I was very happy reading other people's novels. I didn't think about, I wrote, as I said before, I had written poetry for a long time, into my 30s. And I had a short story published in Red Book magazine, back when Red Book was publishing novels and good short stories, in their good authors in their issues. But I had never, I hadn't done anything. I hadn't written fiction. I hadn't written poetry. And then just one day, one night, actually, when I couldn't fall asleep, these two characters just came into my head, and I just fell in love with them. And one was George and one was Lizzie. And basically, at the very beginning, that's all I knew about them, was that, here are these people, George and Lizzie. And then kind of night by night, over a period of years, I would get to know them better. And I would, in my head, sort of write paragraphs about them. I kind of learned how they met and, what happened to them and all of that. It isn't autobiographical. I'm not Lizzie at all. And, well, you can't say at all, because I think an author always puts part of him or herself into the book. but Lizzie's escapades in high school were not my escapades in high school. Let me say that. And my agent was not fond of the book at all, of George and Lizzie. She didn't think she could get it published. She thought it needed to be much more commercial than it was, which meant she wanted it to have a lot more plot, which wasn't what I could do or wanted to do. But it did get published by Simon and Schuster, and I had a wonderful editor, Tara Parsons, who would just who when she gave me, did her first letter to me about what she wanted, what she thought needed to be done, she just asked me like 10 really searching good questions, and then let me just go and answer those questions, and that made the book immensely better. So I'm really indebted to Tara as well. And, in some ways, Lillian, this will sound really strange. In some ways, I really regret publishing the book because there's so much more I'd love to say about them. I still think about them all the time. There's a minor character in the book that I think about, oh, that would be fun to write about him. But I haven't done anything.
Do you plan to write a sequel or a follow-up, or?
It's so much work and it's so hard. And at this point, I'm at the point where I'm telling myself stories to fall asleep, rewriting that first line or that first paragraph.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I know a lot that would happen, but just the thought of sitting down and typing it, I mean, it's always perfect in your head, and then you sit down and you type out a sentence and you look at it and you think, oh my God, that's just crap. I don't know that I'm up for that at this moment.
Maybe not at this minute.
Right.
So maybe later. Yeah.
Yes.
And your latest writing endeavor, The Writer's Library, has just come out in paperback. So that's pretty exciting.
It is. It's so my co-writer, Jeff Schwager, who really had the idea for this book, he and I traveled to interview authors in their homes. Most of them, we were in their homes. One we did at the fiction library in Brooklyn. We interviewed an Ethiopian American writer named Maza Mengistu there. And that was great. And it's different from other author interview books in because we didn't interview them about their books. We interviewed them about the books that they loved.
Yeah.
And probably many people's favorite chapter in the book is Michael Chabon and his wife, Ayala Waldman. We went to their house in Berkeley and sat around their table, their dining room kitchen table, and just talked books for a couple of hours. And just seeing them, they're both writers. Michael, of course, is much better known than Ayala, but Ayala did a great mystery series called the Mommy Track Mysteries, and like 3 other novels, I think. So just watching them, when it's just so much fun to talk to somebody who loves to read. Yeah. And here we were, we had it all, we taped everything, and just hearing them talk about the books that they loved, the books that Michael, was a great reader aloud to his kids, and read aloud to his kids for, until they were teenagers. It's just a different view of writers. And plus, reading that book and reading the books that those writers loved, you just get a whole new list of books that you'll want to read as well.
Right. And you have a greater understanding of how they became the writers they are by what they read. So
absolutely. Yeah.
So, and there's a little bit, I'm hearing murmurs that there's a graphic novel being written on your life as a librarian.
Oh, no, not a graphic novel, a picture book.
Okay, a picture book.
So in a very nice closing of the circle, Sasquatch Books is publishing next year, and I think August of 2022, a picture book called Library Girl, which is based on my experiences at the Detroit Public Library, at the Parkman branch of the Detroit Public Library. And it's written by a woman named Karen Henry Clark, and it's illustrated by a Portland artist named, oh my gosh, something Murray. I'll remember that. But anyway, and I think it's still, I think you could access it. I mean, not access the book, but see the specs. Yeah.
So
Cheryl Murray. Her name is Cheryl Murray. Cheryl with an S, Sherryl. And the illustrations are fabulous. And I sort of went through, I don't have a lot of pictures from my childhood, but I did find a picture of me with my bike charger that I used to ride to the library, and she used that as part of the story. Karen used that as part of the story, and there's an illustration of me with charger, the watercolor of that, and then there's the photograph at the end of the book, so you could actually see my bike and me.
Oh, how darling. That's going to be a great book, a picture book for the upcoming librarians.
Yes. And
yeah.
It's really a tribute to libraries. Yeah. It's really a love letter to libraries and librarians.
Yeah.
Miss Whitehead is in it. My elementary school librarian, Miss Glenn, is in it. Miss Long, another librarian at the Parkman Library, is in it.
Yeah, wonderful. Coming out next year, did you say?
August.
Okay,
August.
All right.
Yes.
All right. Now, good. I would be remiss if I did not mention that you have been the inspiration for not one, but 2 library action figures. Right. So I'm just going to say that. Note the words librarian and action. Nancy Pearl, your life is illustrative of why those 2 words are wedded.
Yes, well, it has been an interesting life. Lily, this has been an interesting, flash, an interesting,
Yeah. What are your thoughts on the future of libraries? What do you wish for libraries, and what do you foresee?
Well, what I wish for libraries, I sort of mentioned before. Yeah. I really, librarians, let me preface it this way. Librarians have always stepped up and done what needed to be done. When the first great wave of European immigrants came to the United States at the turn of the 20th century, the first decades of the 20th century, librarians set up English classes, doing that kind of thing. And where there are homeless issues, librarians have stepped up to deal with that as best they could. But librarians are not trained as social workers, and it is the cities or the counties or whoever has, whoever is wherever that is occurring, that it needs to deal with social service issues, not the library. So that's one worry that I have, that people, that the cities are not stepping up. It makes me furious. The other thing that worries me is that so many libraries, this is what I alluded to earlier, that so many libraries are moving away from the traditional role that a library has served in a community. That I think is a mistake, and it makes me very sad. The other thing, another thing that bothers me, that makes me sad, is that I don't think librarians sell libraries. I don't think librarians are very good at I don't think that many librarians are very good at talking about the importance of a public library in a community. A public library is the heart of a community. It is the bedrock that a community rests on. It's the place where everybody, no matter what their race, what their religion, what their economic status, whether they're documented or undocumented, whether they're homeless, whoever can come in that door and be treated like everybody else. And it's the public library is really the last small d democratic institution. And it's based on, it's the core of library service is that equal treatment of the citizens. And
everyone is welcome.
Yes, everyone is welcome. And that I think we as a profession don't do a great job in talking about why the public library is so important. So put that all together. That's
okay.
That all makes me sad.
Yeah. Okay. So how about if I open it up to questions from the audience right now? Would that
So I see that somebody asked, how does a library obtain enough copies to take it to a citywide level? It comes out of mostly, well, with us, with the Seattle Public Library, originally it came out of that grant that we got from the library, from the Wallace Reader's Digest Fund. But other libraries do it within their budget. Buy a certain number of copies for however many they think they can afford. And then, people who take part in it can also, of course, buy it from local bookstores.
Yeah.
Well, maybe we covered everything so thoroughly.
We do have a question from Dan, though. He wants to know which 3 authors, living or dead, would you invite to your dinner party?
Oh, that New York Times question. That's such a hard question. The trouble is that so many of the books that I love are not, the authors are not people that I necessarily would want to have at a dinner party. Oh my gosh. I don't know. I can't answer. I don't know.
Yeah, that's a hard question. There's so many.
Yeah. I mean, who would I want? Let's see. I'll tell. So Richard Ford, these are authors that we interviewed that I felt like Jeff and I could have just talked to them for hours and hours and hours. Richard Ford is a great storyteller. I would have loved to have dinner with Eudora Welty, who Richard Ford knew. I would really have loved to have interviewed John le Carré and asked him how he always could foretell the next hot spot, the next big thing. But I guess who I'd like to spend time with and ask questions, who I'd love to interview for a second time is Terry Pratchett, who was just a brilliant, lovely man.
Yeah.
In an updated book list to go, is there a Puerto Rico book you could recommend?
Wow.
If you will send me, Carol, if you could send me your email, I will look for something. And it might be fiction, so I hope that's okay. So if you could just put that in, I can copy it down. What can citizens do to support the library system as a social asset and part of the city's social infrastructure? So I think that we should always ask everyone who's running for city office whether they have a library card and when they've last used it. I think that we need to make clear to the next city librarian, whoever that might be, or the people who are choosing the city librarian, that books and reading is important, is very important to Seattle, to the citizens of Seattle. We pride ourselves on being a reading city. We need a city librarian who recognizes that and supports that. And I think just talking about how important the library is, why it makes a difference.
Yeah.
So here's a question. You've met so many authors. Is there any author who left you tongue-tied or who you were embarrassingly gushing over? Total fangirl. Yes. Terry Pratchett. I interviewed Terry Pratchett many years ago. And I loved his books. I loved him. I felt so lucky to interview him. And I would ask my students in my genre class at the university to watch the interview because it was about fantasy fiction, one of the genres. And universally, the students would say, "Oh my God, Nancy, you just gushed. You were just, totally fangirling all over him," which is true. I have to say, it's a little embarrassing to watch that interview, so I have not watched it. But yes, that, and I have to, and yes, the Pratchett interview should be on YouTube for sure. If not, let me know, and I will, and we can get it out of the Seattle TV archives.
Yeah. Seattle channel. Is it on the Seattle channel?
Oh, the Seattle channel, but it's on YouTube now.
Okay.
So, okay. I think we have, I don't think I have anything left to say, Lillian.
Oh, okay. And no more questions?
No more questions, but I think I may have found the link to the interview. Let me just make sure.
Okay.
Nancy, is this the right episode?
I don't know. I don't want to go away from this.
Okay.
I think if you Google Seattle, if you Google Nancy Pearl, Terry Pratchett, it should come up.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Nancy, you have touched so many people, introduced us all to books we might never have picked up on our own. But isn't that what reading is about? The serendipitous discovery of reading and how it can change and transform us and connect us. Nancy Pearl, you are a universal treasure, and we thank you.
Thank you, Lillian. Thank you for having me on.
Oh, we're very lucky. Thank you so much for presenting and answering all my questions.
Thank you for doing that.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.